In the year 1816, the ocean concealed a story so haunting that it would scar French history forever. It began with a proud warship, the Medusa, carrying more than 400 souls across the Atlantic. They dreamed of glory, wealth, and a new life on the faraway coast of Africa. Yet the sea had other plans. What should have been a routine voyage turned into one of the darkest tragedies of the age. A stranded ship, a desperate crew, and a floating raft that became a nightmare, where hunger, madness, and betrayal tore away the very fabric of humanity. Tonight, as you listen, you will drift with us into this forgotten world. We will trace every moment, from the ship's departure to the horrors on the raft, to the few who lived to tell the tale. But I must warn you, this is not just a story of the sea. It is a story of human nature itself. And, as the waves rise around us, you will be left to wonder, what would you do if survival meant losing everything that made you human? Welcome to the tragedy of the Medusa, the floating forest of beasts. You are listening to Sleeping Radio. The summer of 1816 was one of optimism and rebuilding for France. Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated at Waterloo the previous year, and the restored monarchy under King Louis XVIII was eager to reassert French presence overseas. Among the plans was to reestablish colonial control over Senegal, a region in West Africa where French trade outposts had once thrived. To accomplish this mission, the French Navy prepared a small squadron of ships, the most important of which was the frigate Méduse, or Medusa. She was a vessel of war, though aging, with 3 masts, wide sails, and a reputation for speed. On board, she would carry soldiers, administrators, settlers, and supplies to the colony. In early June, over 400 people crowded aboard the Medusa at the port of Rochefort. There was a sense of excitement in the air. Families with children spoke eagerly of the opportunities awaiting them in Senegal. Soldiers bragged of their future victories. Merchants calculated profits in their heads. The ship, though cramped and not especially luxurious, seemed like a vessel of destiny. Yet even before departure, doubts arose. The man placed in command was Captain Hugues Duroy de Chaumareix. Though once a naval officer, he had little real experience. His appointment was political, a reward for his loyalty to the monarchy rather than his skills at sea. Many officers and sailors whispered that he was unfit to lead such a crucial expedition. But orders were orders, and on June 17, 1816, the Medusa lifted anchor. Alongside her sailed 3 other ships, the Loire, the Echo, and the transport ship Argus. Their course was set across the Bay of Biscay, down the coast of Portugal, through the Canary Islands, and then across to West Africa. The voyage began with celebration. Musicians played on deck, wine was shared, and the passengers, a mixture of nobles, officers, craftsmen, and laborers, enjoyed the adventure. The sea glittered in the summer sun. The sails caught strong winds. For many, it felt like the promise of a new life. But beneath the surface, problems grew. Captain Chaumerays often relied on civilian passengers for advice, including a former colonial official who claimed to know the safest routes to Senegal. Skilled navigators on board protested, warning that such shortcuts were dangerous, but they were ignored. The captain drove the ship too close to the West African coast, trying to shave days off the journey. His eagerness to arrive quickly would prove fatal. By the end of June, signs of trouble were obvious. The waters became shallow, sandbanks hidden just beneath the waves. Experienced sailors urged caution, but the captain pressed on. He ordered full sails, driving the Medusa dangerously near the coast of Mauritania. On July 2nd, 1816, the disaster struck. With a sudden shudder, the Medusa ran aground on a hidden sandbar near Cape Blanc. The great ship trembled. The masts creaked. Passengers were thrown off balance. And within moments, the proud vessel was stuck fast. Her hull lodged in the sand, the waves crashing relentlessly against her sides. Panic spread. Some screamed prayers. Others cursed the captain. Soldiers tried to maintain order, but the truth was clear. The Medusa could not move. Every attempt to lighten the ship, throwing cannons and cargo overboard, failed. The tide offered no mercy. The frigate was trapped. For the passengers, fear turned into dread. The shore lay visible in the distance, but too far to swim. The lifeboats, though present, were far too few to carry everyone. People looked at one another with wide, terrified eyes. And then, a desperate idea emerged. If there were not enough boats, then perhaps they could build a raft. A huge, floating platform of wood, ropes, and barrels, capable of holding the overflow of passengers. It would not be safe. It would not be comfortable, but it would keep them afloat. As carpenters began to lash planks together, no one could yet imagine what this raft would become. A drifting nightmare, where human beings would turn on each other in a storm of madness and hunger. The Medusa had run aground, and with it began the slow unfolding of one of the darkest sea tragedies of the 19th century. The Medusa lay stranded like a wounded beast, her belly pressed into the sand, the waves battering her sides. Hours turned into days, and still she would not move. The crew's desperate efforts, unloading cannon after cannon, throwing barrels of water and heavy cargo into the sea, did little to free her. Each tide came and went, but the ship remained firmly trapped, as though the ocean itself had claimed her. Inside the vessel, the air grew suffocating. Food and supplies were still on board, but fear gnawed at every heart. The officers convened in tense councils. Some suggested sending the passengers in lifeboats toward the shore. Others demanded more time to free the ship. But the truth was undeniable. Hundreds of men, women, and children were still trapped aboard, and there were simply not enough lifeboats. The captain, Hugues de Chaumareys, stood rigid, his pride blinding him. He had ignored warnings from his own officers, and now his command was collapsing. Yet he would not admit fault. Instead, he listened to poor advice and insisted that a raft could be built. It would carry those who could not fit into the boats. The lifeboats, he argued, could tow the raft to the safety of the African coast. The idea sounded desperate, but desperation had already taken hold. Carpenters were ordered to begin construction. Using masts, planks, and whatever timber could be salvaged, they worked day and night. Nails were hammered, ropes stretched, barrels bound. Slowly, a monstrous platform took shape. When it was finished, the raft was vast but crude, about 20 meters long and 7 meters wide. No railing, no shelter, no sail. Merely a floating platform lashed together with rope, buoyed by empty barrels stuffed beneath the planks. It looked less like a vessel and more like a skeletal carcass, waiting to swallow its passengers. Rumors spread among the people aboard. Some whispered that the raft would sink immediately under the weight of so many souls. Others feared sharks, whose fins they already glimpsed circling near the wreck. A few believed they would be deliberately abandoned. Trust, once fragile, began to splinter completely. On the morning of July 5th, 1816, the order was given. It was time to leave the Medusa. Chaos erupted. The lifeboats were lowered into the churning waters, filled with officers, soldiers, women, and the most privileged passengers. Crowds surged, pleading, fighting for places. In the midst of the confusion, the raft was loaded with those who could not be accommodated, more than 150 men and a handful of women. Sailors, soldiers, settlers, even a few officers found themselves pushed onto the massive wooden platform. The moment they stepped on, water surged between the gaps of the planks. The structure groaned under their weight. Already, ankles were soaked, and men clutched at one another for balance. But there was no turning back. Ropes were fastened between the lifeboats and the raft. The plan was simple. The boats, with their oars, would tow the raft slowly but surely toward the distant shore of Africa, which lay invisible beyond the horizon. Hope flickered in the eyes of the men as the lifeboats strained forward, dragging the raft from the side of the stranded Medusa. For a brief moment, it seemed salvation was possible. The raft swayed but floated. The lifeboats advanced. The coastline, they told themselves, was not far, but the sea is rarely merciful. Within minutes, the raft swung wildly in the current, tugging against the ropes. The boats strained, their oarsmen sweating, but progress was agonizingly slow. Each wave pulled the raft backward. Each gust of wind made the ropes creak and snap. Shouts rose between the crews of the boats and the raft. Accusations, curses, cries of despair. And then the unthinkable happened. One by one, the ropes were cut. To this day, no one knows exactly why, Perhaps the lifeboats feared the raft would drag them all to their deaths. Perhaps chaos and panic seized the officers. Perhaps cowardice alone guided the blades. But with each rope severed, the raft drifted farther away. Men screamed from its planks, waving arms, begging not to be abandoned. Yet the lifeboats pressed onward, leaving the raft to the mercy of the Atlantic. On that bare platform, over 150 souls were left adrift, with no sails, no compass, almost no provisions. They carried only a few casks of wine, a small ration of water, and some salted meat. The sun beat down mercilessly. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction. As the figures of the lifeboats shrank into the horizon, silence fell upon the raft. Men looked around, their faces pale. The ocean rocked them gently, but beneath the surface, shadows moved, the circling shapes of sharks. In that moment, hope collapsed into dread. The raft was no longer a vessel. It was a prison of wood, floating aimlessly on a vast, indifferent sea. And within days, it would become something far worse. A stage where hunger, thirst, madness, and violence would transform men into beasts. The first night fell heavy over the raft like a shroud. The horizon swallowed the sun in a crimson blaze, and soon only the heaving dark of the Atlantic remained. The raft drifted, rising and falling with the swell of the waves, its planks creaking, its ropes groaning. The men huddled close, clutching one another not from warmth, but from fear. There were no lanterns, no sails, no guiding star. The lifeboats that had abandoned them were gone, their faint silhouettes erased by the distance. On every side stretched nothing but black water, endless and eternal. Above, the sky glittered with cold, indifferent stars. Below, the ocean whispered with movements unseen, the ominous rushing of fins just beneath their feet. In that first night, the raft bore the weight of more than 150 souls. Sailors, soldiers, officers cast aside, craftsmen and settlers, all pressed shoulder to shoulder. The platform was so crowded that men had to stand or crouch in shifts. Lying down was nearly impossible, and the planks were already soaked, seawater lapping between the cracks, drenching legs and clothes. Some tried to cling to order. A few officers urged calm, promising that the lifeboats would soon return with help. Others muttered prayers, repeating them in whispers, as if words could keep the sharks at bay. But beneath these fragile threads of hope, tension crackled. Each man knew the truth, though few dared say it. They had been left to drift, alone. By dawn of the second day, hunger and thirst began their slow torment. The raft carried only a handful of provisions, a few barrels of wine, a cask of water that quickly leaked into the sea, and some salted meat. Divided among so many, it was nothing. The sailors attempted rationing, dipping cups into the wine and passing them hand to hand. The sour liquid burned throats, and soon quarrels broke out over whose turn it was. The sun climbed, merciless and blazing. Its heat reflected off the water, blinding eyes, baking skin. Men tore at their shirts, tried to shade their heads with scraps of cloth. Lips cracked, tongues swelled, eyes reddened. Without fresh water, thirst became a gnawing beast. Some dipped their hands into the sea and licked the salt, only to gag as it worsened their torment. By the third day, discipline collapsed further. Groups formed, little tribes on the raft. Sailors clustered with their comrades. Soldiers banded together. Officers clung to scraps of authority. Each group eyed the others with suspicion, as though survival itself were a contest. Every man began to wonder who would live and who would be sacrificed. That night, the ocean turned violent. The raft pitched and rolled, waves slamming against its sides. Men were thrown into the water, clinging to ropes, screaming. Sharks cut through the dark like shadows of death. Their fins sliced the surface as they circled, waiting for the weak to fall. In the chaos, 2 men slipped beneath the surface, pulled away by the current. Their cries lasted only moments before silence swallowed them. For the rest on the raft, the horror was worse than hunger or thirst. The realization that the sea was not empty, but alive with predators, watching, waiting. By morning, madness had begun to whisper. The combination of heat, hunger, thirst, and fear made men restless, their minds fraying. Arguments broke out. Some accused the officers of betrayal. Others shouted that they should build a mast and sail, though no sailcloth existed. A few swore that the coastline was near, pointing to clouds on the horizon that vanished with each passing hour. On the 4th day, the first true violence erupted. Wine rations had dwindled, and desperation turned to rage. Groups fought over the remaining barrels, men grappling, fists swinging, knives flashing. Blood stained the wet planks. Several men were stabbed and hurled into the sea, their bodies thrashing before sinking into the depths. The sharks fed well that day, their frenzy churning the water red. The raft was no longer a vessel of survival. It had become a battlefield. The planks were slick with blood and brine. Men crouched, clutching weapons fashioned from broken wood or knives smuggled from the wreck. No one trusted anyone else. Sleep was nearly impossible. Even closing one's eyes was a risk. Yet, in those early days, a few voices still clung to order. A naval officer named Savigny attempted to keep some discipline, urging the survivors to conserve strength, to resist the spiral into chaos. He kept a log, recording their ordeal, but his words, though rational, could not quench the fire of despair spreading across the raft. By the end of the first week, more than 20 men were gone, claimed by the sea, by sharks, or by their fellow passengers. And still the horizon remained empty. No sails appeared, no rescuers came. The men on the raft began to whisper to one another in hushed, trembling voices. They spoke of hunger that would not relent, of thirst that blistered their throats. They spoke of survival, and slowly dark thoughts crept in. thoughts that would soon turn the raft into a nightmare beyond imagination. Dawn came without mercy, a pale band of light spreading over the heaving plain of water. On the raft, men blinked into wakefulness, with the same thought grinding in every mind. Thirst. Lips had cracked into painful seams. Tongues felt swollen. The salt on their skin burned like ash. Around them, the ocean glinted with the cruel brightness of a world that offered everything except what they needed most. A quiet pact formed among a few officers and sailors to impose some thread of order. They gathered the remaining provisions to the center of the raft. 2 small barrels of wine, a cask that leaked brine-stained water, a few sacks of biscuit turned to paste, and strips of salted meat. A carpenter took count as if numbers could conjure more from thin air. Savigny, the naval surgeon, urged restraint and proposed a ration. Another man, an engineer named Correard, suggested a different economy. Conserve strength, share shade, rotate the places at the raft's edges where the water rose and drenched the legs. For an hour, the plan held. Men cupped wine carefully, passing it with both hands as though it were sacred. They chewed salt meat in silence, heads bowed, the way people pray. Then the sun climbed, heat thick as a fever, and the fragile spell broke. A group of soldiers, younger, proud, still stung by the humiliation of abandonment, argued that rank had to matter even now. If the officers had failed them, why should officers eat first? Another group, sailors hardened by storms but softened by thirst, claimed seafaring knowledge gave them priority. Without them, the raft would be lost. Words sharpened to insults. Insults hinted at threats. Somewhere in the middle stood the civilians, artisans and settlers who had boarded the frigate with heads full of distant plans, and now could not understand how their lives had been drawn into this crude geometry of wood and fear. By afternoon, the sea rose under a freshening wind. The raft tilted, slipped, and shuddered as waves shouldered it aside. In the scuffle to secure the provision pile, a barrel of wine tipped and began to roll. Men lunged at once. Hands grappled, feet slid. Bodies struck the planks with hollow thuds. The barrel lurched, teetered, and bounced toward the edge. A dozen arms caught it. A dozen more tried to wrench it free. Then someone's knife flashed. A short, desperate movement, and the plug came loose. Wine hissed into the slats, dark and vanishing. Panic flared. Faces contorted with rage and terror. The tumult ended with the barrel empty. Its promise bled into the sea. That night, a weather change. The air grew heavy, the wind thick with the taste of iron. Lightning stitched the distance. Thunder walked toward them over the swells. The men lashed themselves and each other to the planks with strips of rope, belts, torn sashes. When the storm struck, it struck in roaring sheets. Rain hammered their bodies. Sweet, wondrous rain. And they opened their mouths to the sky like children. For a breathless interval, joy returned. Water, cool and clean. They filled hats and scraps of cloth, squeezed the wetness over cracked tongues. They laughed, they cried, they blessed the storm. Then the waves reared. The raft climbed and plunged, the world reduced to the sharp edge between sky and sea. A wall of water swept across the planks, peeling men from their places and rolling them like driftwood. Ropes snapped, a spar broke. Cries were swallowed. 3 men vanished into the dark. Another clung to the edge until a shadow moved beneath him, and he was gone, taken without a sound. All through the tempest, the raft rang like a drum, as if invisible fists were beating it from below. When the morning came, gray, exhausted, and thin, the survivors took stock. The provision pile had scattered. A sack of biscuit was ruined, a bundle of meat lost, 2 knives gone. Faces were different, older by years, emptied out. And into that emptiness crept the word that no one wanted, a word that circulated in whispers and was denied as soon as it reached the ear. Survival. They tried to push the thought away with work. Under Coreard's urging, they rigged a makeshift mast from a spar and fragments of rope. Shirts and a torn sailcloth became a patchwork canvas. When the wind caught it, the raft actually answered, a small miracle. It scudded clumsily but obediently, able now to veer a little, rather than drift entirely at the mercy of currents. The men cheered, and for a few hours, hope found a foothold. They set a watch. They scanned the horizon. Someone swore he saw gulls. Someone else declared the water's color meant shallower seas. But hope requires fuel, and by evening they had none left. The sea had rinsed the biscuit to mush, the meat to foul strips. The wine was nearly gone. Thirst returned like a judge delivering sentence, and with it returned suspicion. The quarrel that night began as a low swell between 2 groups, and rose quickly to a breaking wave. A soldier accused a sailor of hoarding. The sailor accused an officer of lying about the ration count. The argument leapt into other grievances. Who had been pushed toward the edge during the storm? Who had been hauled back by a friend who had not? In the cramped, wet world of the raft, every movement could be interpreted as betrayal. Knives appeared, not brandished high, but held low, close to the ribs, as if proximity could make them private. A scuffle, the thud of bodies, a cry that cut off mid-breath. In the frantic moments that followed, men wrestled, slipped, crashed into one another. The raft tilted. The sea hissed through the seams. An officer shouted for calm and was struck to the planks for his trouble. When the tide of fury finally ebbed, 2 men bled into the slats, and another was missing. The survivors stared at their hands as if they no longer recognized them. Night brought a terrible stillness. The stars looked near enough to pluck from the sky, yet utterly beyond reach. Hunger had become a living presence among them, an animal that paced in circles. Some tried to sleep and could not for long. Every doze ended in a start, a grasp for a rope, a dream of falling. Others sat awake, eyes glazed, minds gnawed thin. Somewhere on the raft, a quiet conversation began, halting, ashamed, using no direct words. If a man died, one said, if a man died, would it be? It would not be murder. It would not be a thing to boast of. It would be necessity. Another voice, older, said nothing for a time and then whispered, "We are not beasts." The sea gave no answer. Morning revealed what night had hidden. One of the injured had slipped away, or been helped away, and the water around the raft was troubled by fins. The men looked at the place where he had lain, and then looked at one another, and then looked away. That day they tried to fish with hooks bent from nails and threads teased from cloth. A single silver shape flashed at the surface and eluded them. Around noon, a small bird circled and landed, foolish with fatigue, and a sailor caught it in both hands as though he were cradling hope. They divided it into pieces the size of a thumbnail. No one was satisfied. By now, voices on the raft wore two tones, one that still tried to sound like the world they had left, measured, human, bounded by rules, and another that came from the edge of a great cliff, where thoughts fell and did not return. In that second voice, the unspeakable finally became speech. A man said very softly, "He is already dead." Another answered, "We will die if we do not." A third squeezed shut his eyes and shook his head as if a swarm of flies had found him. What happened then was not shouted and not recorded in any neat line. It is enough to say that hunger won the argument. The men who participated walked away with their faces set, and the men who did not turned their backs and pretended the sea was fascinating. A prayer was said, ragged without a proper ending, and afterward everyone was silent for a long time. When the wind rose again, the sail filled, and the raft moved on. It carried with it men who had crossed a boundary they had never imagined crossing, and others who had stood on that threshold and shivered, and all of them were still together, still lashed by common need. If salvation existed, it would have to find them here, on this drifting proof that civilization is a thin fabric, and the sea, patient and endless, can wear it through. That night, the stars did not look like jewels. They looked like holes in a cold ceiling. Somewhere far behind them, the wreck of the Medusa lay quiet on its sandbank. Somewhere far ahead, a shore waited, indifferent, and on the raft, now nicknamed in whispers, the floating forest, for the way men stood like dark trunks swaying with each swell. The survivors bowed their heads and did not sleep. They had not become beasts, not yet. But the line had blurred. And once a line blurs, the world beyond it can be terrifyingly easy to enter. The raft drifted on, a fragile stage set against an endless horizon. By now, days had lost their numbers. Time was measured not in hours, but in the rise and fall of the sun, in the slow dwindling of provisions, in the faces of men hollowed by thirst. Their cheeks had sunk, their skin had blistered, and their eyes, once human, glimmered now with a strange, dull light. What remained of order was stretched thin, like a rope frayed by too many storms. Officer Savigny and Engineer Correard still tried to impose some discipline. They encouraged short watches, insisted the men sit in rotation to rest weary legs, and begged them to conserve what little energy they had. But authority is a fragile thing when set against gnawing hunger and the wild certainty of death. By the 8th day, the raft had become a divided world. On one side, those who clung to some idea of civilization, discipline, fairness, even honor. On the other side, the desperate and the furious, who argued that survival was owed only to the strongest. Voices rose, and the planks themselves seemed to tremble beneath the weight of argument. It began with whispers. The officers have more rations. They drink while we starve. They will abandon us if a ship appears. These murmurs spread like sparks across dry tinder. By dusk, the sparks had become fire. A group of soldiers, young, restless, maddened by thirst, conspired to seize control of the raft. They spoke of dividing provisions equally, of steering their own course, of throwing weak men into the sea to lighten the load. Their leader, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, shouted above the waves. Why should we suffer under their orders? They left us to die already. Let us take what is ours. The raft stirred with voices. Some cheered, others cursed. Officers tried to reason, but reason was brittle. Knives appeared again, held low but ready. The scarred soldiers' followers surged forward. In the push and struggle, a plank cracked beneath stomping feet. The raft groaned. Water gushed between its seams, and for a moment it seemed the entire platform might splinter. The mutineers pressed on, lunging for the wine barrel. A sailor struck with an axe handle, another with a broken spar. Blood smeared across wet wood. The clash was brief but savage. A dozen men fell, stabbed, beaten, shoved into the waiting jaws of the sea. The water boiled with fins as sharks claimed the fallen. Screams were cut short. Crimson spread like ink in the tide. When dawn broke, silence reigned again, but it was the silence of exhaustion. The mutiny had failed. The officers, aided by the loyal, had fought them back. The scarred soldier was gone. Pulled under, his rebellion dissolved into salt foam. Yet the victory was hollow. Nearly 20 more men had perished in that night of fury. The survivors sat in stunned quiet, gazing at one another with haunted eyes. The raft had grown emptier. Spaces once crowded now stood open, planks slick and vacant where comrades had stood. Still, there was no relief, only dread, for the provisions dwindled further and the sun showed no mercy. By the 10th day, madness became their closest companion. Men began to see things that were not there. Some swore they saw green fields rising on the horizon, dotted with cottages. Others cried out that ships sailed just beyond sight, their sails gleaming white. More than once, men leapt into the water, certain that land was near. None returned. At night, delirium deepened. Survivors spoke to invisible companions, laughed at shadows, or wept without sound. A sailor clutched a piece of driftwood as though it were his child. Another whispered prayers in a tongue no one recognized, rocking himself until sleep claimed him. Savigny and Coréard watched with despair. They knew what was coming. Hunger had already pushed men across one boundary. Thirst had driven them across another. The next step was one few could bear to name aloud. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a storm of voices rose once more. Men demanded food, demanded meat. Their stares fell upon the bodies of those who had died in the mutiny, lying stiff on the planks, half hidden beneath scraps of cloth. The air thickened with unspoken intent. A sailor whispered, "If God did not wish it, why would they be here?" Another answered, "The sea took its share. This is what remains for us." That night, the raft crossed another terrible threshold. By the light of the moon, the dead were carved into portions. There were prayers, yes, but prayers mingled with sobs and curses. Those who could not stomach it turned away, pressing cloth over their faces. But hunger is not merciful, and by morning, nearly all had partaken. It was the ultimate betrayal of civilization, the act that stripped them of the last illusion that they were still what they had once been. Yet in that horror, they lived another day. The raft was smaller now, in numbers and in spirit. Where once had been a crowd of 150, now fewer than 70 remained. Their bodies were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their souls fractured. And still, no sails broke the horizon. As the days stretched on, the floating forest of beasts drifted further into nightmare. The raft rolled gently under a cruel sun, its ropes slackened, its planks swollen with brine. Those who remained clung to it like barnacles, each man reduced to a husk of what he had once been. Their cheeks were hollow, their lips split and crusted white with salt. The sea had carved them down to something raw, something less than men, and yet still clinging to life. No one truly knew how many days had passed. Some said 12, others 14. Time was no longer measured by sun and moon, but by the slow count of the dying, by the shrinking circle of those who still had strength to speak. The air was heavy with madness. Hunger and thirst had not only weakened bodies, they had unstitched minds. Men mumbled to themselves, their eyes staring into distances no one else could see. They spoke to ghosts, to lovers far away, to comrades long dead. Sometimes they laughed at nothing, a shrill sound that unsettled all who heard it. Other times they wept, silent tears tracing lines through the salt and grime on their cheeks. Visions came easily now. One man swore he saw a lush meadow just beyond the horizon, green grass rippling in the breeze, a spring bubbling clear water. He stood and pointed, his face radiant, his eyes wild with hope. Before anyone could stop him, he leapt into the waves, arms stretched toward his mirage. The sea closed over him, and a fin cut the water where he had vanished. His cries turned to gurgles, and then there was silence. Others saw ships. They cried out in joy, waving rags of cloth, shouting with what voices they had left. But the horizon was empty, mocking their desperation. Each disappointment gnawed at them, dragging them deeper into despair. The raft itself seemed cursed. The salt water had loosened the lashings. Planks shifted beneath their feet, leaving gaps wide enough for a leg to slip through. The survivors feared each wave would finally tear the structure apart and scatter them like driftwood. They tried to repair it with strips of clothing, with nails pulled from broken boards, with knots tied by trembling hands. But the sea was stronger than their efforts. Every day, the raft sagged lower into the water. The smell of death clung to them. Corpses, too weak to be thrown overboard, lay in corners of the raft, their faces turned to the sky, their mouths open in silent screams. Some were used as shelter, their stiff bodies leaned against as though they were furniture. Others were hidden under scraps of cloth, their presence denied but never forgotten. At night, delirium worsened. The survivors huddled together, their minds slipping between dreams and waking nightmares. One cried out that he was back in France, at his mother's hearth, eating bread warm from the oven. Another insisted he saw a city of lights just beyond the horizon. Music drifting across the waves. A third clawed at the planks, convinced the raft itself was a coffin, and he was buried alive within it. Some gave up entirely. They lay down, closed their eyes, and surrendered. By dawn, their bodies were still, their spirits gone. Each death was met with a grim silence. No prayers, no ceremony. Only the dull recognition that there was now one less mouth, one less rival for the fading provisions. Those who clung to survival began to look like shadows. Savigny still tried to keep order, writing notes on scraps of paper, recording their ordeal with the meticulousness of a surgeon. Coreard still spoke of land, calculating currents, insisting that if they endured just a little longer, they would reach the coast. But even their voices had grown thin. their authority frayed. The raft had become a floating asylum, adrift on a sea without end. And then, as if the ocean itself mocked them, the sky changed. One afternoon, heavy clouds gathered, blotting out the sun. The air thickened, heavy and electric. A wind rose, cool and promising. The survivors lifted their heads, mouths open, sensing rain. When the first drops fell, they cried out with joy. They lifted their faces, spread their arms, drank in the sky. They caught water in their palms, in scraps of cloth, in their very hair. For a moment, laughter returned, weak, hollow, but laughter nonetheless. But the sea is never merciful for long. The drizzle thickened into a storm. The wind tore at their makeshift sail. The waves reared like mountains, battering the raft. Men clung to ropes, screamed as the platform pitched and rolled. Water crashed across them, sweeping several into the deep. The raft groaned, its seams yawning open. When dawn came, the storm had passed, but so had more lives. Their number had fallen again. Some said 40 remained, others fewer. It hardly mattered. They were a fraction of what they had been, a dwindling congregation of the damned. They had survived another storm, another night, another day. Yet each survival felt less like victory and more like prolongation of a punishment no one could name. On the 14th day, silence settled. The men lay sprawled across the raft, too weak to quarrel, too empty to dream. The sea lapped gently, indifferent to their suffering. Somewhere in the distance, a gull cried, and on the raft, the survivors turned their heads slowly, as though the sound might be salvation, or only another mirage conjured by their withering minds. The raft drifted like a skeleton upon the sea, its planks warped, its ropes unraveling. What had once held more than 150 souls now bore fewer than 20. Their faces were hollow, their bodies shriveled, their minds half consumed by delirium. The ocean had become both prison and executioner. On the morning of the 13th day, a cry rose, faint at first, then stronger. A survivor pointed with a trembling hand. Far in the distance, across the rippling horizon, a dark shape moved. For a moment, no one believed it. They had seen too many mirages, too many visions born of thirst and madness. But this was no illusion. It was a sail. The ship drew nearer. A brig named Argus, part of the very squadron that had once sailed with the Medusa. The survivors erupted in desperate joy, their hoarse voices cracking as they shouted and waved scraps of cloth. Some wept openly, others collapsed in prayer. They raised trembling arms toward salvation. At first, the Argus seemed to pass them by. Terror swept the raft, the fear that once again they would be unseen, forgotten. Men screamed until their throats bled. But fortune at last turned its gaze upon them. The lookouts on the brig spotted the ragged shapes waving from the sea. Orders rang out, sails shifted, and the ship turned toward the raft. When the rescuers drew close, horror seized them. What they found was not a vessel, but a floating graveyard. The survivors were gaunt, barely human, their eyes sunken and wild. Bones jutted from their skin. Their clothes hung in tatters. Around them lay corpses stiff and half-consumed. The stench of salt, blood, and decay filled the air. One by one, the starving men were pulled aboard the Argus. Some were too weak to climb, lifted like children by sailors' arms. Others clung to the ropes as though afraid this too was a dream. Out of the 150 who had once been set adrift, only 15 remained alive. The sea, at last, released its victims. The survivors were carried to Senegal, where doctors tended to them. Their bodies were emaciated, their skin burned black by the sun. Many were too weak to speak. Yet slowly they began to recount what had happened: the abandonment, the storms, the mutiny, the madness, and the final descent into cannibalism. When their testimony reached France, it exploded like a cannon blast. Newspapers carried the tale, and the public recoiled in outrage. How could the pride of the French Navy have abandoned so many to die in such a manner? How could a captain so incompetent have been placed in charge of a mission so vital? A court-martial was convened. Captain Chalmerays, whose arrogance and inexperience had doomed them all, was sentenced, though leniently, to only 3 years in prison. Many felt justice had not been done. For the families of the dead, punishment was a pale comfort. Yet the story of the raft could not be buried. It became a symbol of corruption, of arrogance, of the fragility of civilization itself. Writers retold it, pamphlets spread it, and most powerfully, the young painter Theodore Géricault immortalized it on canvas. His vast masterpiece, The Raft of the Medusa, unveiled in 1819, showed not triumph but despair. Emaciated survivors straining toward a ship in the distance, surrounded by the dead and the dying. The painting shocked Europe, forcing all who saw it to confront the horror of what had happened. For the survivors, however, no canvas could capture the truth. They lived with the memories etched into their minds: the sound of waves crashing over planks, the cries of mutiny, the whispers of madness in the night, the taste of desperation. They carried not just scars on their bodies, but shadows in their souls. The raft had drifted into legend, but for those 15 men, it had never truly left them. And so, the tragedy of the Medusa ended not on the sea, but in memory. A story carried forward as both warning and wound. Out of more than 150 souls cast adrift, only 15 returned to tell the tale. The ocean had tested the limits of human endurance, and in its vast indifference, It had shown what lies beneath the thin veil of civilization. Was it courage that saved them? Or was it cruelty? Was it fate? Or was it failure? These questions echo still, unanswered, across the centuries. But tonight, as we close this story, let us step back from the storm and return to quiet waters. Let the waves that once carried despair carry us now toward rest. The Medusa is gone, her raft long vanished, her survivors long returned to dust. Only the lesson remains that the sea is vast, and that within its silence we glimpse both the best and the worst of what it means to be human. You have been listening to Sleeping Radio. May your night be calm, your dreams gentle, and your rest free of storms.